start. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff. The liftoff of the space.
In our natural pursuit of knowledge, space has always mystified and beguiled us. Over the past 5 decades, we've pushed the final frontier inevitably onward into the ether. The cost has been colossal. Now every day, new data, new conclusions, and the thirst for deeper exploration propel us inexorably onward. The advantages of the discoveries made through space travel are myriad, but the fundamental curiosity as to what is out there will always fascinate and taunt us. Come with us now into the unknown and discover the disappearing frontier. This is Saturn V, the rocket that would send 3 Americans toward the moon in Project Apollo. But this historic journey couldn't be attempted without knowledge. Knowledge based on experience that came through seeking the answers to certain basic questions. Could a human being withstand an 8-day flight to the moon and back? Could a man control the movements of his spacecraft, rendezvous and dock with another vehicle orbiting the moon? Could he leave the protective cover of his spacecraft and perform useful work in space? Could he function effectively as an experimenter and use spaceflight to advance human knowledge? Could the Apollo spacecraft be guided and controlled during re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere so that it could make precision landings any place on Earth? If the answer to any of these questions was no, it had to be known before 3 men would travel 250,000 miles to the moon. And so in 1961, the Gemini program came into being as the necessary prelude to Apollo. This is the story of Gemini and its legacy to spaceflight, coming up in Disappearing Frontier. As always, training had been intense, but ultimately, of course, there was no substitute for being there. Gemini took the men, the tools, and the problems into orbit. In the 18 months between March 1965 and November 1966, 10 manned missions were launched from Cape Kennedy. 16 astronauts journeyed to their spacecraft on Launch Pad 19. Virgil Grissom and John Young were first, then James McDivitt under Edward White, Al Gordon Cooper and Charles Conrad, Frank Borman and James Lovell, Walter Schirra, Thomas Stafford, Neil Armstrong. David Scott, Eugene Cernan and Michael Collins, Richard Gordon, Edwin Aldrin. 4 of the Gemini astronauts made the trip twice. Together, these men helped thrust the United States into an era of exploration. Gemini was a single concept with a number of assignments. It was in a sense one launch, one flight, one recovery.
Stand by for 10-second countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition. Liftoff.
Space is infinite. It yields slowly to exploration. In their journey into this environment, the Gemini astronauts logged more than 1,940 man-hours of flight. Hurtling through space at 5 miles per second, they circle the Earth 600 times. In their 40 Earth days in space, they witnessed, as few men have, hundreds of sunsets on the changing horizons of our planet. Sweeping over continents in a matter of minutes, they gained a new perspective of Earth. For Gemini, equipment and techniques were developed that enabled astronauts for the first time to maneuver their spacecraft, to change their orbit, to accelerate to new heights. The first Gemini maneuvers were basic, flying in formation with the spent second stage of the Titan II rocket. Then a more difficult step, rendezvous, finding and approaching another craft in space.
Okay, Gemini 6, ready to copy. Okay, P8, 06, 3500, pass at Hawaii.
The first target for rendezvous was another manned spacecraft. Gemini 6 approached within 1 foot of Gemini 7. Rendezvous, a major landmark in the history of manned flight. Aboard Gemini 7, astronaut Borman prepares to take motion pictures of Gemini 6 as the two spacecraft begin their station-keeping exercise.
And we have LOS officer, both vehicles at Hawaii.
10 rendezvous were accomplished during the Gemini program. The techniques varied, for this maneuver is important to Project Apollo. The lunar module, on returning from the surface of the Moon, must rendezvous and dock with the command and service module. In Gemini, conditions for lunar orbit were simulated in Earth orbit, and confidence in Apollo grew. On 4 of the Gemini missions, the rendezvous target was the Agena space vehicle. During the program, the Gemini astronauts located and docked with the Agenas 9 times, developing the experience and confidence in this important maneuver. This experience is vital to the lunar mission, for the Apollo astronauts would dock twice on their journey to the Moon and back. As the spacecraft moved in, docking lights on board the vehicle helped guide the pilot during the final stages of the maneuver.
Okay, Gemini 8, it looks good here from the ground. We're showing tone rigid. Everything looks good from the dock. Okay, working the signal, stop on switch. Roger. Flight.
But not everything always went according to plan. On Gemini 8, a thruster failed, causing excessive yaw and roll. On being unable to find the source of the trouble, the command pilot, Neil Armstrong, undocked. The roll rate accelerated, reaching an alarming 1 revolution per second, but Armstrong fought and won his struggle to gain control, and he brought Gemini 8 to a safe landing. On Gemini 9, when an Atlas rocket failed to place the Agena into orbit, a substitute docking target was launched. Trouble developed on the new target when its shroud failed to separate, leaving what the astronauts quickly named the Angry Alligator. Although the docking maneuver had to be cancelled, the flight plan was revised so that the astronauts could go on to practice rendezvous 2 more times, developing faith in their ability to cope with adversity and to learn from the unexpected. On 2 missions, the Gemini astronauts actually assembled a new spacecraft in orbit, the combined Agena and Gemini. After docking, they commanded the Agena to restart its own rocket engine. On one mission, this space-filled vehicle was flown to a record altitude of 851 miles. From their vantage point in space, the astronauts had a spectacular view of our planet. Although flight experience was the primary objective of Gemini, the program offered a unique space laboratory to science, medicine, and technology. More than 50 experiments were carried on the Gemini spacecraft. Many were repeated on several flights. One experiment was photography of the Earth. Masked areas never before seen by humans were studied. More than 2,000 photographs were taken from space during the Gemini program. These pictures were used to correct maps and provide oceanographers, geologists, and geographers with new information about the Earth. The Gemini astronauts also used their cameras to photograph cloud patterns and other atmospheric phenomena. This work supplemented information obtained from unmanned weather satellites. Hundreds of high-resolution photographs were made to provide new knowledge about the weather of the world. The astronomical sciences also benefited from Gemini, for the orbiting spacecraft enables scientists to send instruments far above the blanket of atmosphere, which filters and obscures a variety of phenomena. On Gemini 12, an eclipse of the Sun was photographed for the first time from space. The results of scientific research conducted on Gemini have been made available to the world, not only helping to advance our knowledge, but also promoting a greater measure of understanding among nations. Three of the manned Gemini missions were flown to investigate the problems of long-duration spaceflight. Gemini 4 was a 4-day mission, Gemini 5 8 days. On Gemini 7, astronauts Lovell and Borman spent 2 weightless weeks in space. These flights confirmed the endurance of man and his new spacecraft systems. They showed that an astronaut could live in space for a period that's longer than a round trip to the moon, and thus paved the way for Project Apollo. Using the Agena space vehicle, the astronauts also experimented with a new technique for holding their spacecraft's attitude fixed with respect to the Earth. Normally, this required the continuous use of fuel. But on 2 missions, a Dacron tether was attached between the spacecraft and the Agena.
Tether is nicely taut now, and I think we can keep it taut.
The Agena, slightly nearer the Earth, was pulled more strongly by gravity than was the spacecraft. This small difference was enough to stabilize the vehicles so that they could maintain their positions without the use of fuel. This technique would have important implications for future space missions. Perhaps the most spectacular experiments of the Gemini program was extravehicular activity. Astronaut Ed White made the first American walk in space. Squirts of gas from White's handheld maneuvering device thrust him in the desired direction. The floating object in the foreground is the astronaut's overglove, left behind in the spacecraft.
I've exhausted the fuel now, but I was able to maneuver myself outside the spacecraft back. I maneuvered right up back on the back of the adapter. Took the back Jim, came back into his view. The only thing I wish is I had more. This is the greatest experience. It's just tremendous.
In contrast to Ed White's successful 20-minute walk in space, the next 3 men to venture outside their spacecraft encountered unexpected difficulties. Although some useful work was accomplished, including on one mission the historic retrieval of a scientific experiment left behind on an earlier flight, workloads were higher than anticipated. The astronauts had trouble stabilizing themselves outside of the spacecraft. All 3 walks had to be terminated early. The difficulties encountered on these missions pose profound problems for future space exploration. So another careful and more tightly controlled test was prepared for Gemini 12, the last flight in the program. Prior to this flight, astronaut Aldrin trained intensively underwater, pacing himself for his walk in space. The tasks assigned to him were designed to compare the difficulty of working in a weightless environment with work under normal gravity. On January 12, the problem of excess workload was overcome by frequent rest periods and the use of improved body positioning restraints, such as waist tethers, handholds, and foot restraints. Extravehicular activity was to have important applications to the lunar mission. Apollo astronauts would leave their vehicle and install scientific equipment and collect samples on the surface of the moon. This required experience working in pressure suits and performing tasks in the near vacuum of space. The success of EVA during Gemini would also give Apollo astronauts returning from the lunar surface the ability to board their command module, even if they were faced with docking difficulties. Gemini provided more than 12 hours in extravehicular activity. The training, the caution, The slow accumulation of facts paid off. Man could work in space. On all Gemini missions, a major objective was to develop re-entry flight path and landing control, so the spacecraft could land at a specific place on Earth. This required the development of new techniques for guiding and controlling the re-entry of the spacecraft. This is the view from the spacecraft window as Gemini re-entered the Earth's atmosphere. Glowing particles boiled off the heat shield to leave an incandescent wake. During Gemini, 10 manned spacecraft made this fiery re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. Gemini 12 was the last. Its re-entry in November 1966 climaxed a program which would really have no end. For Gemini is illuminating the future. Of first importance is the fact that Gemini sent more men into space and kept them there longer. Gemini multiplied American men's spaceflight experience 37 times. Gemini was instrumental in showing the world the way towards cooperation in the peaceful exploration of space. Gemini also leaves as its legacy a greatly expanded science and technology, proof that government, industry and the scientific community can work together to translate humankind's boldest dreams into action. In the front ranks of the bearers of Gemini's legacy are the astronauts themselves. These veterans were now ready to face the challenge of Apollo. Apollo, with its new questions, new problems, and longer, more difficult voyages. But after Gemini, one question no longer needed to be asked. Now we knew it could be done. That brings us to the end of this edition. We look forward to your company next time. But remember, we are out there. What we can and can't see is out there, and the mysteries between us, although seemingly insurmountable, are encompassed by a disappearing frontier.